Hello and welcome to Sprott Radio. I'm your host, Ed Coyne, Senior Managing Partner at Sprott. I'm pleased today to welcome a new guest to Sprott Radio, Dr. Tim Gregory. Dr. Gregory is a senior nuclear chemist at the United Kingdom National Laboratory. Dr. Gregory, thank you for joining me on Sprott Radio.
Thanks for the invitation. It's good to be here.
You know, as a new guest on Sprott Radio, maybe tell us a bit about yourself, how you got into this field and sort of who you are as a person.
Sure. I wanted to be in a rock band when I was a kid, but I ended up becoming a scientist instead. I've always loved science ever since I was a kid, right before I can even really remember. And after my undergraduate degree in geology, I did a PhD in cosmochemistry, where I measured the age of the solar system by dating meteorites using radioactive dating. And it was really during my PhD that I always say that I learned my trade, which is as an analyst. I learned to measure the chemical and the isotopic composition of rocks. And it's very similar to what I do for my job now in the lab as a chemist. I measure the chemistry and the isotope composition of all sorts of interesting nuclear materials. And you would be surprised at how similar the two jobs actually are, although the materials are very, very different. The cool thing about the tools of science is that you can apply them to different problems. And so actually, the instruments that I run on a day-to-day basis and the types of chemistry I do now for my day job, they're very, very similar to what I did in my PhD and in my postdoctoral research after my PhD as well in cosmochemistry, which has been quite the learning curve applying that tool set to a different area of science.
I bet. Let's stay on the PhD for a moment. I have to be honest, cosmochemistry, I didn't know that even existed, and that probably says more about me than your field of study. But talk more about that, because as I looked into that, I'm fascinated by that. And you talk about the study of meteorites and kind of the history lessons you get from that. And walk us through making a decision to focus on that for your PhD, and then B, what that really involves or what that entails. I think that'd be fascinating for our listeners.
It's so amazing. It's such an incredible subject. And my undergraduate degree was in geology. And it was actually after the third year of my undergraduate degree, before my master's year, I interned at the Johnson Space Center down in Houston, Texas. And so I flew out for the summer, which was just amazing. I mean, I was like the kid who had NASA T-shirts growing up. I was just completely obsessed with NASA and the moon and Apollo and all that growing up. And so to get to go to the Johnson Space Center I was 21 at the time, was honestly a complete dream come true. And my project for the summer was to use the tools of geology to unpick the history of a meteorite that had been found in Antarctica in 1994. And that's when I really fell in love with the lab, because I hadn't really spent that much time in the lab up to that point. And I got to use all these incredible instruments that I'd only ever read about, scanning electron microscopes, electron probes, mass spectrometers. And that's when I really got the bug for analysis, being in the lab, obsessing over detail, very, very detailed, careful work you get really immersed in. And that's what motivated me to do my PhD. And, I remember at the time, I knew that isotopes were really important. Okay, I write about isotopes in my new book, Going Nuclear. But isotopes are different versions of the same element that have the same chemistry, but they have different masses because they have different numbers of neutrons in their nuclei. And I knew that isotopes were really, really important for all different areas of science, including cosmochemistry. I didn't know a huge amount about them, and I knew even less about how we measure them precisely. And so I saw this PhD position come up at the University of Bristol here in the UK that was dedicated to measuring the isotopic composition of meteorites. And maybe, I don't know, looking back naively, I thought, well, I don't know anything about that. I should do that as a PhD. But I guess the whole point of doing a PhD is that you learn things that you didn't previously know. And that's where I learned to run mass spectrometers. And mass spectrometry really is my bread and butter. It's my particular area of scientific expertise. But it's kind of funny, like I said, I learned my trade measuring the composition of meteorites, and now I measure all sorts of things: nuclear fuel, nuclear medicines, space fuels, all sorts of cool things.
I do want to throw a fun fact out there, or maybe a question about a fun fact out there. You mentioned that you were at the NASA Space Center in Houston at 21, which must have been really fascinating. But you were also on a BBC series called Astronauts. Do you have what it takes So before, I don't mean to embarrass you, but can you
No,
talk
no.
about that? Because as I uncovered some more stuff, I thought that was fascinating also. So maybe give us a little taste of that as
Yeah,
well.
for sure. So I remember vividly, I was having a cup of tea and I was looking on Twitter. This was back in 2016, and I saw an advert from the BBC calling for people to apply for this program, or a show, as I guess you'd call it, which was basically astronaut selection. And I thought, wow, that sounds amazing. I mean, everyone's going to apply to this, so this is a long shot, but you've got to be in it to win it, right? So I applied and ended up getting down selected to the final 12 and went through the rigors of astronaut selection, and went through many of the same tests that real life astronauts get put through as they get selected. Of course, it was televised, but I must say, the BBC did a great job at kind of making it this blend of kind of like reality TV, but also very kind of educational and authentic. And amazingly, I made it down to the final 3, much to my surprise. Pipped to the post by an amazing lady called Susie Imber, who's a planetary science professor at the University of Leicester. She was incredible. She ended up coming first, but runner-up is not bad, and I was the youngest contestant by quite a long way. So.
That's fantastic. Well, what were you lacking, sadly, that didn't get you to number 1?
If I'm being kind on myself, probably life experience.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough.
There we go.
Well, let's circle back to your PhD for a second, because I got to believe your first book, titled Meteorite, and you're really talking about just, all the building blocks of the universe that had to come from your PhD. Can you talk about, I want to get to your most recent book also, but can you talk about your first book for a moment and kind of how that came about?
Yeah, sure. So I'd completely immersed myself in the subject of cosmochemistry and meteorite science, at least when I wasn't going through astronaut selection. So, and I'd read all of these amazing papers and gone to these amazing conferences. I'd kind of had a glimpse and a taste of what it felt like to look down the barrel of a microscope at a meteorite and think, wow, this thing is like older than planet Earth. This rock existed before the planet existed. And actually verifying that myself, like I hadn't just read that in the literature or a textbook. I'd actually measured the edge of a meteorite myself, and it's like being stood on the edge of this cliff of deep geological time. It's absolutely incredible. And I thought someone has got to write a book on this, because this is just such a cool subject. And I know that space is just such, like, everyone loves space, right? It's probably the most popular area of science. But oftentimes it's astronomers who steal all the limelight, and fair enough, because astronomy is incredible. But I thought maybe people might be interested in learning about space from the perspective of geology, looking at the rocks that fall to the Earth's surface all the time. 40,000 tons a year, can you believe it, of meteorites fall to the Earth's surface every year.
Really?
Yeah, really.
Wow.
Most of it's microscopic, and it falls into the oceans because Earth is 70% covered in water. But the ones that survive and that we find, they're the meteorites, and from them we've unpicked the form, how the solar system formed. We've discovered the age of the solar system and the age of the Earth. It's an absolutely incredible subject. And so I wrote Meteorites as I was doing my PhD, actually, alongside my thesis, much to the dismay of my supervisor. I think he thought I was probably getting a little bit too distracted, but it came good in the end.
Yeah, impressive. The book came out in 2020 and you got your PhD in 2019, so you can clearly multitask.
Yeah, for sure. It was a real joy to write that book, actually. It just kind of happened. I'd never really, I mean, I'm an avid reader. I grew up on Carl Sagan, Richard Feynman, all of the great popular science writers. I never thought I had even one book in me. It was quite an eye-opener as well, kind of realising, oh, I can actually write a book. So that was fun. That was fun. And it was such a lovely book to write, actually, like just from like the author's perspective. Mm-hmm. It was a real like nice kind of articulation of a subject that's so fascinating and so cool. And people have enjoyed it too, which is great.
The way you talk about the building blocks and the origin of life from meteorites and how that sort of came to be and how it created, the planets and the entire solar system.
It's unbelievable. And, the origin of the chemical elements as well. I always think, like with physics, the origin of physics was the beginning of the universe, and we don't know how that happened. The origin of biology was the origin of life, and we don't know how that happened. But the origin of chemistry We know exactly how that happens. It happens in
Mm-hmm.
stars with nuclear synthesis. And so I dedicated an entire chapter to that. And again, it's very interesting that the physics of the inside of a star, how you build heavy elements, those that you can't produce through fusion, so that's everything on the periodic table above iron, is exactly the same way that you make heavy elements inside a nuclear reactor. And I hadn't realised that before I took my sideways career step. And so again, it was another example of how you can take the tools of science from one subject and apply them to a different subject. And although, nuclear scientists use slightly different terminology and there's different jargon to astrophysicists, the underlying science is very, very similar. In fact, it's identical with neutron capture. And so that's been a real eye-opener. It's been great, and it's been really interesting.
Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about kind of nuclear power today. Talk about some of the things that are going on out there. What's got you excited about it? Let's just start with, why do you think nuclear power is got this new resurgence of being talked about at the dinner tables in a way that they hadn't been for the last, decade or two?
Yeah, sure. It's deeper than nuclear power. It's energy. Energy is like this amazing currency that we can use to generate prosperity and raise living standards. If you look at GDP per capita, living standards, all of the things that we value in life in the modern world, they're all enabled by energy abundance, and how we harvest the energy that the world needs to prosper. I'm not just talking about maintaining or hopefully raising living standards in the developed world, but I mean eliminating poverty in the developing world, giving everybody in the world the kind of living standards that we enjoy in Europe and in America. You need energy to do that. The question is, how do you harvest that energy without damaging the natural environment too much in the process as collateral damage? And solving that problem is one of the biggest challenges of the 21st century. If you solve the energy problem, you solve the economic problem, you solve the humanitarian problem, and if you do it smartly, you can also solve the environmental problem as well, because, of course, we get most of our energy, like the vast majority of our energy, from fossil fuels, which are great in many respects. They've enabled the modern world. They're very convenient, and with our modern technology, they're not too difficult to find and extract either. But of course, they come with a massive environmental and human health cost, not least in the form of climate change and air pollution in people's lungs. And so if we can harvest energy on the scale required without damaging the natural environment, I honestly think that's one of the things that we should be focusing on in the 21st century. And it's my view and the view of lots of other people, and I think increasingly lots of other people as well, that nuclear power has to be a part of that. And again, it's my view and the view of lots of other people now that it has to be central to that future.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. And I think these terms like clean energy or net zero or sustainable energy, they seem for a while to only be in the kind of the hydro, solar, wind camp, and nuclear was sort of left behind. What do you think has changed to where more and more people are saying, hey, that's really defines nuclear? When you're talking about those kinds of terms, you're talking nuclear. What do you say to that as more people start to kind of embrace this or educate themselves on nuclear energy in general?
Yeah, it's really interesting. If you fire up Google and go on Google Images and search clean energy or green energy or something like that, it's just pages and pages and pages of wind turbines and solar panels. And I don't want to live in a world with no wind turbines or solar panels. They're okay. They're really good at getting you started, but they're not enough on their own. I think part of the reason is when we think about net zero and decarbonisation, we've kind of got this tunnel vision when it comes to renewables. The point of net zero is not to replace fossil fuels with renewable energy sources. It's to replace fossil fuels with carbon-free electricity sources. Renewable is a bonus. I don't want to be too harsh on the kind of proponents of wind and solar, but it's a bit naive to think that we can get there with wind and solar alone. We live in societies that are absolutely, utterly dependent on massive amounts of reliable power. Wind and solar cannot sate that need. And the wind and solar lobby have done such a fantastic job over the last 20, 25 years as positioning themselves as the answers to net zero. Whereas the nuclear crowd, at least up until recently, have largely stood in the corner and hoped that no one noticed them.
Right.
I think is maybe a slightly uncharitable way of putting it, but it's how it seems to me and lots of other people in the industry. And so With the urgency of phasing out fossil fuels and gaining some semblance of energy independence as well, people are starting to take another look at nuclear, because once upon a time it was seen as the future of humanity's energy needs. This is actually not new. Much of the nuclear technology is actually decades old.
So let's talk about that for a second. There's a lot of negative bias around nuclear still.
Yes, there is.
More and more people. It seems like younger people. I've had some, students on in the past talking about nuclear and so forth. They seem more to embrace it. But I'm 56, and my generation, and maybe just a touch older than me, they have a negative bias towards it. So, what would you say to those that either A, have a negative bias towards it, or are even further on the side of being anti-nuclear? What would you say to them as we go down this path today?
I would say think again. Seriously, think again, because it's probably not as bad as you think. There are a few key points that kind of motivate people to be, if not overtly anti-nuclear, very kind of suspicious and wary of it. One of them is safety. So there's this perception that nuclear is really unsafe, and it's understandable because we live in a society where radiation is used as a kind of a spectre in films and TV shows and computer games and popular culture. It's this kind of this invisible, scentless, silent killer that's kind of there lurking in the background. It's used to signal, I don't know, like menace. It's like this phantom in popular culture that's used as a device of fear. And actually, we're all living in radiation all of the time, from natural background radiation, from the sky and from the rocks beneath our feet. And the amount of radiation that people are exposed to as a consequence of nuclear power is absolutely negligible. It's like orders of magnitude less than you would get from background radiation, even for people living close to nuclear power stations. So there's this amazing statistic where if you live within a couple of miles of a nuclear power station, the annual radiation that you're exposed to is about the same as eating a single banana. And bananas are, really, they're made slightly radioactive by the potassium-40 that they contain, which is a naturally occurring radioisotope. And, the safety record of nuclear power is impeccable when you put it in context with the amount of energy that we've got from it. On a per terawatt-hour basis, nuclear power is as safe as wind and solar. It's an impeccable safety record that's punctuated by a very small number of very high visibility events, namely 3 Mile Island in North America in the late 70s, which no one died in 3 Mile Island, by the way. The death toll was 0, and nobody was even exposed to anything above background radiation. So I don't actually mention that very much in my book. Chernobyl is what did it in Europe. Right. Europe built more nuclear reactors in the 5 years leading up to Chernobyl than it's built since, which is an absolutely astonishing statistic. And it's even more astonishing when you look at the data and you discover that nuclear power is still Europe's single biggest source of clean energy, despite the fact that we've built hardly any new nuclear reactors since Chernobyl in 1986. And then more recently with Fukushima in 2011 in Japan. Again, the one death has been linked to Fukushima. One single death has been linked to Fukushima from the radiation. There were a few thousand deaths, interestingly, from the evacuation. And most of the evacuation, the consensus in the scientific literature is that it was unnecessary because the amount of radiation that the affected populations would have been exposed to would have had zero discernible health effects at all. And so there's this perception that nuclear is incredibly dangerous because of those rare but high visibility events, and because society is saturated with this radiophobia, which is not a term that I coined. Lots of people have asked me if I coined that term. I didn't. Right. It was already out there.
Say that one more time. I love that.
Radiophobia, the irrational fear of radiation. It turns out that when you look at the data and you step back and take a sober view of these things, splitting atoms in nuclear power stations is one of the safest things that our species does. And in fact, more people die every couple of hours from fossil fuel-related air pollution than have ever died of nuclear power in the last 70 years. And so it's not just a little bit safer than the world's biggest source of power. It's orders of magnitude safer than the world's biggest source of power.
So you said something I thought that was really spot on about the nuclear industry has been sort of standing in the corner and hoping people don't pay attention to them or don't notice them because they've had such a negative light shined on them for so long. What needs to change? We've had guests on in the past that have talked about it really being a PR problem or just an information problem.
Yeah,
How
totally.
does that change? How do we get the industry to really start thinking about that and saying, hey, listen, this is not replacing any one thing, but here's a very safe, sustainable way to create energy, 24/7 baseload energy. What do we need to do to tell that?
I 100% agree. It is a PR problem. The
Mm,
science and the technology is absolutely spot on, as is the engineering and the implementation. It's the PR, and I don't know. I mean, I work in the nuclear industry, and there is this lack of confidence. I can't understand it. 'Cause nuclear power is incredible. It's so reliable. It's the most reliable form of power. We have this metric called the capacity factor,
mm,
where it's kind of like a measure of uptime. If you look at how much power an energy source could produce and look at how much it did produce, the ratio between the two is the capacity factor. And for nuclear, the median capacity factor is north of 80%.
mm.
It's the highest of any power source, so it's reliable. Nuclear waste, lots of people ask me about nuclear waste. I dedicated 2 whole chapters to nuclear waste in my book to really address it. The nuclear industry is the only industry that fully internalizes its own waste. It fully accounts for it, and the cost of the cleanup is actually baked into the price of nuclear power. It fully internalizes the waste, unlike, say, the fossil fuel industry, which externalizes its waste in the form of carbon emissions and the healthcare costs of the air pollution. So it's reliable. It's about as green as it gets when you consider the nuclear waste footprint, when you consider the mining footprint, the land footprint, the amount of concrete you need to use per terawatt hour of energy. I just can't get my head around why we haven't been singing the praises of nuclear power for the last 3 decades. I mean, I know why. I'm not naive. It's Chernobyl. It was Chernobyl that did it.
Right.
The reputation of nuclear power never really recovered from it. I can't help but feel that the response to Chernobyl was probably overblown a little bit to kind of rub it in the face of the Soviet Union, because this was the late 80s, remember?
Right.
And
Fair.
and so there was probably an element of that as well. But, we're already a quarter of the way through the 21st century. People care more about climate change. There's a bit more of a renewed effort to lighten our burden on the natural environment. We're facing economic crises across the developed world, certainly in Europe. Not so bad in North America, but there are economic problems too. Energy is this great enabler of prosperity, economic development, raising living standards. There's a concerted push, and I think it's about time.
Yeah, that's well said, and I want to stay on the waste topic just for a moment. One of the
Yeah, sure.
terms that in your book and doing other work that I see a lot of times, the word spent fuel gets replaced for waste. Talk about that a little bit, because I think people think that you use it, it's gone, and then it's just a sludge left over, and we have to store it somewhere. But there's more to it than that. Can you talk a little bit about spent fuel versus waste?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are different types of nuclear waste, but the one that people really, really care a lot about and spend a lot of time talking about is so-called high-level waste. By volume, that's a very, very tiny fraction of the nuclear waste. It's like a couple of tenths of a percent of the total volume of nuclear waste, but it contains almost all of the radioactivity. Okay, per unit volume, it's incredibly radioactive. And high-level nuclear waste is basically spent fuel. It's fuel that's been in a nuclear reactor, typically for 3 to 5 years, something like that, depending on the type of reactor and the country. And when you pull spent fuel out of a reactor, it's incredibly radioactive because it's full of so-called fission products. These are the atoms into which uranium splits when it undergoes nuclear fission during nuclear power generation. And these fission products are incredibly radioactive, but there's this weird paradox with radioactivity and nuclear waste. The more radioactive something is, the less of a time it's a problem, because the shorter lived the isotope, the shorter the half-life, the quicker it decays. Okay, and so the radioactivity of spent fuel diminishes actually quite rapidly because fission products tend to be quite short-lived. After a couple of centuries, the radioactivity of fission products is kind of back down to the radioactivity of the ore from which you originally mined the uranium. And so it's a problem on historical timescales, or a challenge on historical timescales is probably a better way of putting it, because it's a problem that's been solved. We can talk about that perhaps in a couple of minutes about what Finland have done on that front. But
Sure.
when you look at the chemical inventory of spent fuel, those fission products are actually only a tiny fraction of the spent fuel, typically 3 or 4%, something like that. The other 95% plus of the spent fuel is either uranium or plutonium, both of which can be used to generate more nuclear power. And so by disposing of so-called nuclear waste wholesale, we're actually throwing away a valuable resource. 95% of spent fuel can be turned into nuclear power, which is just an absolutely astonishing realization. And there are technologies that we can use to fully extract that power. And so, for example, by chemically separating the plutonium from spent fuel, we can actually put it back into a reactor and use it to generate more power. And that's what France have been doing for decades now. They actually recycle the plutonium in their spent fuel and use it to generate more power. And so really nuclear waste is a misnomer, because 95% of it is useful. It's kind of like the old view of aluminium cans, right? When you've had a Diet Coke, you would throw the can away and it would end up in landfill. We don't see aluminium cans as waste anymore, because we can turn them into something new. We can turn them back into a can or a frying pan or a jumbo jet wing, something like that. So it goes with nuclear, with spent nuclear fuel as well. It's actually a valuable resource.
Yeah, I think we have to change the term permanently to spent fuel, not waste at all. I think we need to lose the word waste completely.
Yeah, I'd be in favor of that.
Yeah, well, thank you for that, because I think it's something that I find in cocktail conversations. People are asking me, I'm like, I don't really know, but I'm going to find out. So I appreciate that explanation.
And it's completely mind-blowing. It's not just like 10% of it's useful. 95% of it is useful. It's the biggest misnomer out there.
Yeah, that's astonishing. Let's shift a little bit. Talk about not just from an energy standpoint, but what other benefits can we extract from nuclear? What else can you use nuclear energy, nuclear power, for? Is there anything else out there besides just creating energy that we can benefit from?
Right. So when we talk about our energy systems, we spend a lot of time talking about electricity. Electricity is just it's amazing. It's like magic. I mean, it's clean at the point of use. It's so versatile. You can use it for all sorts of different things. But there's more to our energy system than just electricity. One of the big components of energy system, especially in industry, is heat. Okay, we use heat for all sorts of things. We use it for steel. We use it for making fertilizers. We use it for making chemicals. We use it for making steam, for heating. We use it in paper mills, food and drinks factory, all sorts. And so heat is really, really important. But the sad thing is that it's very difficult to decarbonize. It's not very efficient making heat with a wind turbine or a solar panel. It's very costly in terms of electricity. Nuclear power, actually the electricity is secondary. The heat is the primary energy from nuclear. A nuclear reactor really just warms water up to make steam for a turbine. It's the warmth that's the primary energy. So for these hard-to-reach sectors, such as the steel industry, the chemical industry, the fertilizer industry, nuclear-derived heat is a really, really good way to decarbonize those sectors. We can use the heat to decarbonize these industrial processes, which are responsible for quite a large percentage of humanity's total carbon emissions. And so it goes far beyond just electricity.
It does, and I think you even talked about it from, there's medical applications. There's all these different things out there, and we don't want to stretch it too far, but it just keeps going, it seems.
Just putting nuclear energy and nuclear power aside for 1 second. So, no big deal, we've solved climate change, and we can grow our economies. Just put that aside for 1 second. There are so many other applications of nuclear science as well. One of them is nuclear medicine, which is totally amazing, and it's something that I'm fortunate enough to actually work in as part of my day job. I'm working on a project in nuclear medicine, and this is where we use radioactive substances to diagnose and cure illnesses. And the way it works, in short, is we take a radioactive substance and we slot it into a molecule, a very carefully designed molecule, designed such that it preferentially latches onto, say, a cancer cell. And so if we inject these radioactive molecules into people's bodies, the the cancer will mop them up and basically make itself radioactive. And so when that atom decays, it releases its nuclear energy into the cancer and basically fries it from the inside out. It's curing cancer on the smallest scale possible, which is one atom at a time, which is, it sounds like the last thing you would want to do is inject radioactivity into people's bodies, but this medicine has been used for decades. It's available here in the UK on the NHS. Lots of people have nuclear medicine therapies all the time for diagnostics and curative nuclear medicine. And one of the really promising things about nuclear medicine is that we're only just beginning to tap the chemistry set that's available to us. When you look at the periodic table, and specifically the different isotopes of the elements on the periodic table, you find that there's a very rich concoction of isotopes that are suitable for nuclear medicine. And so there's lots and lots of research and development ongoing right now as we're recording that I'm sure will be deployed certainly within my lifetime. I mean, I'm only 32, so I'll hopefully see all of this unfold over the next half century or so. But it's very, very promising. It's amazing. It's such a brilliant intersection between clinical science, medicine, and nuclear science.
Well, first of all, I was taken back a little bit when you just said only 32, because that's what you've done in your 32 years has been pretty, short of miraculous. I mean, good for you for all the stuff you've accomplished already, which is amazing. Well, it sounds like, this is an extension of just the kind of the basic block and tackle of radiation, but they're being more pinpointed in as far as how they can treat these things, which I think you're right. We're at the tip of the spear on the technology that's going to happen in medicine with all sorts of applications.
Yeah, for sure. There's a particular type of therapy that's really exciting called targeted alpha therapy. And alpha radiation, listeners might remember from high school science, is one of the types of radiation. And it's a high-energy helium nucleus that's ejected from an atom as it decays. And alpha particles are very high energy, but they're really big and burly, so they don't travel very far before coming to a stop. And so just a couple of centimetres of air is plenty to block an alpha particle. And so by medicalising these very specific alpha-emitting isotopes, we can inject radioactivity into people's bodies. The tumour will mop them up, and it's very, very localised. Alpha particles do not travel very far before coming to a stop, and so the collateral damage to other parts of the body is I mean, I don't want to say non-existent. That would be overdoing it a little bit, but it's very, very small collateral damage, and so targeted alpha therapy is particularly exciting, and there are a couple of isotopes that are very promising in the very early stages of clinical trials for getting that up and running.
Well, that's going to be exciting to watch unfold. And this actually brings me to your most recent book that came out earlier this year, Going Nuclear. But what's more important is the tagline on how the atom will save the world, right? So talking about from a medical standpoint, from an energy standpoint, from a GDP standpoint, can we unpack that for a few minutes and talk about your most recent book? Because I think it really hits the salient points on why nuclear energy today. Could you just maybe give us 4 or 5 talking points on your most recent book as well?
Yeah, for sure. Looking at the big picture, there's so much to be worried about in the world. I don't know if you feel it, but it just seems a little crazy at the moment.
Yeah.
The future is so uncertain. There are so many big problems, global problems. It's kind of difficult to see what the world is going to look like in just a couple of decades. But for me, and this has been true for all of my life, and this is true of my colleagues and scientist friends as well, that science is just, to paraphrase one of Carl Sagan's books, this candle in the dark, right? It's this source of hope. It's one of the best tools we have for solving problems, whether it be the energy and the economic problem with nuclear power, whether it be what we were just talking about with new novel ways to diagnose and cure illnesses, whether it be breeding new types of crops using atomic gardening, which is an amazing technique that's been used for decades to breed weather-resistant, drought-resistant crops that need less fertilizer, or whether it be settling on the surface of the moon and thriving one day on the surface of Mars. Nuclear power taps into all of these things, of all of the areas of science. And they're all amazing. They're all brilliant and beautiful and great at solving problems. But of all the areas of science, nuclear science in particular is one of the best tools that we have for solving some of the biggest challenges that we currently face in the world and will face in the future. And I guess that was my main motivation for writing Going Nuclear. And I really do mean it when I say how the atom will save the world, because it feels like we're in crisis mode on multiple fronts at the moment. And nuclear power taps into many of the problems that we face.
Well, I mean, between talking about the environmental benefits, the security of energy, the economic advantages, you touched on a lot of, I think, very relevant points that, but basically, even politically, both sides of the aisle are concerned with and talking about. So I think, we're going to see this continue to be a bigger part of a global conversation. And I think you're going to be a very much sought after person for decades to come as you continue down your career path, which is nothing short of spectacular already in a decade or so of your time, really focused on this.
Oh, thanks. I hope so. One of the points that I always try and make, and I went to some lengths to say this in my book, although not quite on the nose, is that whether you are what would broadly be described as on the political left, very preoccupied with environmental issues, with raising living standards, eliminating poverty, or whether you're what would broadly and clumsily be described as being on the economic right, where you're very, very preoccupied with economic growth, GDP, nuclear power is the answer to both of those problems. Nuclear power is for everybody, which is why, actually, of all the political turmoil that we've been through in the UK over the last 10 years, nuclear power is not one of those reasons for argument. It's very encouraging that on both sides of the Houses of Parliament, with our right-wing party, the Conservatives, and our left-wing party, Labour, both have very, very strong support for nuclear power, which is great. This is not a partisan issue. Maybe it can be one of the issues that we unite around, which is surely something that we sorely need.
Well, look, you've got, I went on your website. Obviously, I tagged you on LinkedIn. I, tried to learn as much about you as possible. For our listeners that are also curious, what's sort of the best way to track you down, get access to your books, that kind of thing? What can you share with our listeners on ways to find you and keep tabs on what you're up to?
Sure. So I'm on LinkedIn, which is, when I first got LinkedIn, I thought, what am I doing on this? This is going to be boring compared to Twitter, but it's actually really fun.
Yeah.
It's actually quite sportive. It's good vibes on LinkedIn. It's really good. I have a YouTube channel and a Substack. If you just Google Dr. Tim Gregory, that should come up. And the links to everywhere where you can find me is on my website, which is www.timgregory.co.uk.
I will say the styling of your website, actually went back to what you said at the very beginning of this podcast, that you wanted to be in a rock band. Very cool, not scientific looking at all. I encourage people to go take a look at it. Very
thanks.
well laid out. I don't know who designed it, but it looks really cool.
Thanks.
Well, I always like to do this because I can't think of everything. Is there any other topics or maybe points that you were hoping to make today that I didn't give you the platform to do so? Anything else you'd like to talk about as relates to nuclear and energy in general that I didn't bring up?
I really think, going back to that point, if you're unsure about nuclear power, or you've got this suspicion about it, or maybe you're even completely convinced and anti-nuclear, give it a second look. You will probably be surprised. One of the things that, you haven't said this, but some people have said this to me since my book came out, which is, well, you would say all of this because you work in the nuclear industry.
Right.
That's getting the cart and the horse the wrong way around. I work in the nuclear industry because of these things. For me, if something better than nuclear power came along, I would be advocating for that. The point for me is clean energy and lots of it to enable the kind of future that everybody deserves. And so if you're unsure, I'm talking to you right now, have a second look. You will probably be surprised.
Well said, my friend. Well, Dr. Gregory, I can't thank you enough for making the time today. This has been a real treat for me, and thank you for joining us on Sprott Radio.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you all. And once again, my name's Ed Coyne, and you're listening to Sprott Radio.
This podcast is provided for information purposes only from sources believed to be reliable. However, Sprott does not warrant its completeness or accuracy. Any opinions and estimates constitute our judgment as of the date of this material and are subject to change without notice. past performance is not indicative of future results. This communication is not intended as an offer or solicitation for the purchase or sale of any financial instrument. Any opinions and recommendations herein do not take into account individual client circumstances, objectives, or needs, and are not intended as recommendations of particular securities, financial instruments, or strategies. You must make your own independent decisions regarding any securities, financial instruments, or strategies mentioned or related to the information herein. This communication may not be redistributed or retransmitted in whole or in part or in any form or manner without the express written consent of Sprott. Any unauthorized use or disclosure is prohibited. Receipt and review of this information constitutes your agreement not to redistribute or retransmit the contents and information contained in this communication without first obtaining express permission from an authorized officer of Sprott.